Hey, it's Jacob. I'm not a real rock star, but I might loosely be based on the author, who's also not a rock star. Hey, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and tell you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about it, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First off, it's free. Also, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast, like right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm right now to get started. By the Fire presents A Desperate Soul by Dave Smale. Read for you by the author. Chapter 6. As Tilda's house came into view, Jacob noticed that her neighbor Monica's red sedan was there now. He wasn't surprised. She was a homemaker. He paid it little attention. His mind was heavy with the revelation of his impending paternity, and the role he might have played in the mother's decision to terminate. He walked up Tilda's driveway and sat against her front door, a million confused thoughts entangling in his brain. Across the driveway, Monica's front door clicked and opened. "Jacob?" she called. Oh, great, he thought as she walked across her driveway and onto Tilda's. "Jacob, is that you?" Duh, I don't look that much different, he thought. He stared at Monica as if to say, "Go away." Approaching, she sensed his attitude. "Well, it's not going to do you much good to sit here and wait for your grandma to come back," she said. He raised his eyebrows, giving her a half-curious look. Still, he said nothing in reply. "You don't know, do you?" she asked, though it was more of a statement. He turned his hands upward as if to say, "Know what?" "She's in the hospital. You should really go see her," said Monica. "In the hospital?" "Oh, he speaks. Yes, the hospital. As far as I know, she's at Centera Lee," she said, turning and walking back to her house. "Off the boulevard," she called over her shoulder. "Past Newtown Road, unless they transfer her somewhere else. Guess you should go find out, huh?" Jacob knew where Newtown Road was. It was near Bean's apartment complex, but he didn't recall a hospital nearby. The thought of his grandmother in the hospital churned in his mind, and Jacob couldn't think of what to do next. Go to this hospital? Wait here until she came back? Monica said it wouldn't do him any good to wait for her. How long had she been there? What if she didn't come back for a day or more? If he went to the hospital, how would he get there? Monica shut her front door firmly. Jacob hadn't been quick enough to ask her for a ride. If the way she just shut her front door was any indication, he needn't ask. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and keyed in the name of the hospital on Google Maps. Centera Lee Hospital was just over 7 miles away. Too far to walk, but maybe he could catch the bus. He'd never done that before, but he was quickly learning that there was a first time for everything. An hour and a half later, he stepped off the bus in front of the hospital. Wow, an hour and a half to go 7 miles. I should have walked. He asked the hospital staffer at the front desk for Tilda O'Brannon's room number. She punched some keys on her keyboard, asking him of his relation to her. He told her, prompting a few more keystrokes. She directed him to the oncology wing. Oncology? What's that? He wondered. Jacob walked through doors, up elevators, and down hallways within 10 minutes. He got lost and asked directions before finally reaching the nurse's station immediately outside of Tilda's room. The nurse, upon seeing Jacob's appearance, thought it best to question him in order to ensure he was there to see her. "Yeah, she's my grandma," he said rudely. "Oh, you're her grandson. All right," the nurse said. "You haven't been by to see her before." I just found out she was here." "Okay, just let me prepare you then. She probably doesn't look anything like the last time you saw her. She's been through radiation treatment, so she doesn't have any hair. And she's lost a lot of weight. I'm just trying to get you ready, so it's not so shocking when you see her." Jacob looked perplexed. "Radiation? So she's got, cancer or something?" "Well, yes, this is the oncology wing," the nurse replied condescendingly. "So go ahead and go inside. I doubt she'll be awake. I'll get the doctor while you go see her. The doctor's going to want to talk to you." The nurse hurried off as Jacob stepped surreptitiously into Tilda's room, wishing he could be anywhere else in the world. Edging back the curtain, he gasped in horror at the sight. Tilda's thick red and gray curls, which she called salt and paprika, were nowhere to be found. In their place was a medical blue bandana over a pale, hairless scalp. Her mouth was agape, while a look of anguish appeared on her brow. Her normally plump cheeks were sucked inward. Her once healthy arms were so thin, they looked nearly transparent. Jacob could make out each vein and artery as well as the bones in her hands and wrists. It had been an understatement when the nurse said that she'd lost a lot of weight. Tilda looked as though she would blow away with a strong gust of wind. A set of machines beeped, with tubes protruding, which stretched to the bed. One tube was taped to her face and ran underneath her nostrils, while another tube was taped to her arm. Jacob followed it to where it ended, between two of her knuckles. It plugged into her skin. His stomach lurched. Tilda was indeed asleep, just as the nurse had predicted. Jacob watched her for a minute. She seemed comatose. No stirring and no movement at all other than her labored breathing. As he beheld her, Jacob reflected, becoming more nauseous as he did. No matter how much he disliked her prior to leaving her house, he'd never hoped for anything like this. In fact, he'd never imagined that anything would or could happen to his grandmother. At least, nothing that had the ability to cause her to look half this bad. She was in her mid-60s, but right now she looked double that. He stood a few feet away from the foot of the bed, afraid to approach, when a terrifying thought crossed his mind. Had he done this to her? No, that's stupid, he thought. People don't get cancer when their kids leave the house. But he wasn't her kid. His mother, who was Tilda's child, had died, tragically died, along with her husband and their unborn baby girl. Tilda's husband had left her years before. Her other child, Jacob's uncle, made it a point not to speak to her, let alone come visit. And Jacob had to admit that he hadn't been the easiest kid to raise. But who could blame him? He had lost all the same people she had. Well, I never really lost my grandpa or uncle since I never met them, he thought. But Tilda had known them and lost them. Maybe the heartache from the accumulation of lost relationships, the hard time he had given her, ultimately leaving her, and her advancing age had combined into something of a perfect storm. Then again,
Maybe cancer simply ran in the family. Maybe. He didn't know. He registered footsteps a split second before someone in a white lab coat swept into the room. "You must be Jacob," the doctor said. He nodded. The doctor carried a clipboard, wore thick glasses, and a grave expression. She looked to be, well, around the age his mother would have been if she were alive. Mid-40s or so. "I'm Dr. Pollock." "Wow," she said. "You look so much like her." Jacob looked confused. "I look like her?" he wondered. Her who? She must have been talking about Tilda, but he'd never been told that he looked like his grandmother. "Sorry, I meant your mom. I knew her. We went to high school together, hung out a few times. I knew Miss Tilda, too. She didn't remember me, but that's okay. Listen, I'm so sorry for your loss." It's fine," Jacob said. It hit him that the doctor had just spoken of his grandmother in the past tense, though she was still alive. It was more than a little unnerving. "Well, here's what we're looking at. When your grandma came to us, her ovarian cancer was already at stage 4 and progressing rapidly. We sent her to the top-notch clinic up in Philadelphia, but they couldn't help her either. It had already spread to so much of her body. She expressed her desire to just come home instead of trying more treatments. She was in a lot of pain. So we did what we could for her to keep her here and keep her as comfortable as possible." Jacob was taking in the information, nodding as the doctor spoke. "We tried to get a hold of you several times since you're her only next of kin. We weren't successful, obviously," Dr. Pollock said, accusatorily. "Yeah, I don't think she had my number." The doctor tilted her head forward, staring at Jacob incredulously over her glasses. "Nobody did, apparently. We asked her neighbors." "I blocked their numbers," Jacob said. "You blocked them?" He nodded. The doctor sighed. "Sounds like you two didn't have the best of relationships." He shook his head, confirming her assumption. "Well, at least you're here now, but I'm afraid it's a bit late," Dr. Pollock continued, shaking her head. "To be honest, I'm surprised she's held on this long. I've only seen this happen one other time. I had a patient I'd given only a few days to live, but he survived over 2 weeks until his son, a missionary in Africa, came back to be at his bedside. There's no medical term for it, simply the will to live, I guess. So, in my honest opinion, I think she has kept herself alive, waiting for you." Jacob felt strange. "Waiting for me?" The doctor's expression softened. She put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Anyway, I'll be here for a few more hours if you have any questions," she said before leaving the room, closing the door on her way out. His attention turned back to Tilda. An eerie silence fell over the room. The only sounds remaining were the rhythmic beeps of the machines and the faint buzz of the overhead lights. His heart sunk as the weight of the situation crept in. He'd had nowhere else to go when he'd come crawling back to his grandmother's house today, only to find that he'd left her in her time of greatest need. If what the doctor said was true, it was only a matter of days, or even hours, before she too was gone. She would be leaving him all alone in the world. All alone in the world. That's probably how she felt after I left, he thought. Jacob's throat clenched as his eyes welled with tears. He tried to blink them away, but wasn't fast enough. His cheeks wet, he shuffled to her bedside, reached out, and softly touched his grandmother's hand. It was just as he expected, bony, and ice cold. A stark contrast to how he remembered her. Tilda was caring, compassionate, and warm. Not like this. Deep regret overtook him. How had things turned out this way? His grandmother never hurt a soul, yet she was laid up in a hospital bed racked with pain. Was it his fault? Had he driven her to this? Jacob wept openly, knowing he may never be able to tell her he was sorry. He let go of her hand, crying for several minutes. The remorse felt like someone had punched him in the gut. Between sobs, Jacob thought he heard a noise like a wind gust. He checked the window behind him. It was closed. Strange, he was sure he heard something. There it was again. Was that a whisper, he wondered? He peered down at Tilda. Her head rested on the hospital pillow, though her expression reflected nothing close to rest. He looked closer. Her eyes were cracked open, ever so slightly. He leaned in. No way! They're open, he thought. And her mouth was no longer agape. It was moving, barely. Slowly, laboriously, her lips formed words. Air slipped through them. Tilda was whispering. Forgive you, she said. Forgive you, he repeated. That didn't make any sense. Was she talking in her sleep? Was this a good sign or a bad one? Jacob fetched a rolling stool from a corner of the room and wheeled it to her bedside. Now curious, he was determined to figure out whether she was awake and trying to communicate or what? What if her brain was simply firing off random synapses? He'd heard that in a movie once. It sounded intelligent. He sat and rolled within a few inches of her bed. Suddenly, her hand moved. Startled, Jacob sat bolt upright. Had he imagined it? No. Tilda's hand moved slow as a construction crane until it came to rest on his face. He closed his eyes. The icy fingers of her withered hand touched his eyelids and the bridge of his nose. He instinctively froze. Lord, Tilda whispered, open his eyes that he may see. The steady beep of the heart monitor became a long, constant tone as her hand lifelessly dropped to the bed. Grandma? Grandma? He cried. An alarm sounded in the hospital. Code blue, code blue. A pre-recorded voice called over the hospital intercom. The door burst open. A second later, doctors and nurses rushed into the room. Wait! No! Grandma! I'm sorry! He yelled. Please move, a nurse commanded as Dr. Pollock charged in, quickly assessing the situation. No pulse, another nurse said. Get him out, the doctor said, motioning at Jacob. A nurse told Jacob to go to the waiting area. Like a zombie, he slunk from the room, watching the surreal scene. He stopped outside the door, listening. Doctor, do we start a defib? A nurse said. No, she's got a DNR, Dr. Pollock said. Time of death, 11:18. What? Jacob cried. His legs felt like wet noodles. He involuntarily slid down the wall to the floor. She's gone, he thought. His throat closed. He could barely breathe. Jacob gasped, between sobs for several minutes. The hospital staff let him be, shuffling by him. At some point, how much time had passed he didn't know, Jacob stood and staggered to the waiting area. You've been listening to By the Fire. Hey, tell us what you think. Leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you download your podcasts. Or send me an email. info@davesmail.com. info@davesmale.com. Thank you so much for listening. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.